I think the Jedi are a massive system of unchecked power, posing as a religion.
Hashtag Senator Raincourt was right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Decoding TV's coverage of the Acolyte season finale. I am David Chen. Joining me today to discuss this episode of television, he is the co-host of the Amazing Spider Talk podcast. He's also been a guest before on Decoding TV. Dan Gvozden, welcome back.
Happy to be back, David.
Now, I just want to point out, for scheduling reasons, we just finished watching the finale. So, usually I'll want to watch the finale or an episode once or twice, read a bunch of recaps, take notes and stuff like that. Haven't had a chance to do that. This is really fresh. So if we make some mistakes, sorry about that. Please feel free to let us know at decodingtv@gmail.com.
I will say, last time I was on, I think I was even mixing up the name Kyber with Soul the whole episode.
Oh, wow. Are you serious? I don't remember that.
Something like that. I know I caught myself doing it. So again, if I mix up these names, there's a lot of people running around with crazy Star Wars names, and keeping them all straight, I think, is a challenge in of itself.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because I did mess up a name. I kept pronouncing the name Torben as Corbin. There's a character, the Jedi named Torben, who is the dude with the scar on his face and meditating and stuff. I actually kept pronouncing him Corbin, probably because I was thinking of the very famous photographer slash director Anton Corbin. But not him. Sorry about that. Okay, I want to say a couple things before we start our conversation about today's episode. First of all, there was some debate in YouTube and the comments and so on about what exactly was going on in last week's episode, right? What was last week's episode? And my supposition on the podcast, was that last week, episode 7, was what Soul was telling May, right? Because Soul says, well, I'm going to tell you everything now. And then we don't see him say anything. And then, then the episode is kind of this massive flashback that shows everything that happened from Soul's perspective. So I concluded that the most likely explanation is we're seeing what Soul told May. Now, if that's true, that's really weird and problematic in some ways. Like, for instance, there's a scene where, May watches Soul kill her mom. And it's like, May already saw that. Like, why is that a revelation? Why is that important? It's weird that the mechanism by which it's happening is Soul telling May, when really it's Osha who should be hearing this information, right? From Soul, ideally. So I said that was very weird. I think somebody in the comments said, well, you don't know that it was Soul telling May. Maybe it was some force vision that Osha had after she put on the helmet, because the very end of the last episode is she puts on this helmet and we see we hear her breathing and it's dark, and it's like, maybe that's what Osha was seeing. Which I actually kind of like that explanation. That was kind of cool. And then, of course, this episode immediately disproves that is the case, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
It is clear, in my opinion, that last episode was not what Osha saw when she put on the helmet, because we see what happens after Osha puts on the helmet, and she describes a vision that is different than what we saw last week's episode. So it is still baffling to me, why they did it that way with last week's episode. Just drop a flashback with no explanation of whose perspective this is. Why are we learning this information now in the timeline of the story? Who's telling who this information? It's just a weird way to tell a story. Dan, what do you think? Am I?
Yeah. Well, first off, I went back and listened to you and Patrick's discussion of the previous episode of the show, and I largely agree with almost everything you said on that show. I found the previous episode to be really kind of confounding as a payoff to this mystery, and made me ask questions about why does this mystery box format appeal so much to these storytellers when it's so high risk? Maybe there's a high reward payoff,
Right.
to it, but so rarely does it actually work out to anyone's benefit. And I think this episode, I feel, even doubled down on some of my feelings about like, was that risk worth it? But like, so much of what you're describing about like this revelation that Soul killed May and Osha's mother, like, is the kind of emotional backbone of this episode. And I don't feel like that was one. May already knows that, so it
Right.
doesn't
She
feel
saw it happen. Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't feel like a major character revelation for that person, which then makes me ask, like, well, was there some other revelation I was supposed to get out of that? And I think this episode says, nope, it was really just about him killing her. And I didn't feel like that was a big revelation in the first place because, and I don't think you guys touched on this quite so much, but like the moment that it happens of her dissolving into the air, it doesn't even seem like a calculated choice, by Soul to take that action. It's an instinctual,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
oh my God, this woman next to me might be attacking me.
Yeah.
I'm going to lash out. And so,
And by the way, it's never explicitly addressed. Like it's
no,
never
never.
that he never says like, "Oh, I thought she was attacking me," or I thought she was. He says in this episode, "I was trying to protect you," right? Like, but
Yeah.
he never addresses like it was an accident. Like, there's nothing. It's never directly explicitly addressed like why he killed their mother.
For something that is such a linchpin,
Yes.
to like build this mystery box format around it, and then for this episode, which we'll discuss, to hinge the entire emotional like spine of all of these characters on this decision, to have it be so vague. And I'm guessing they would argue like the vagary is the interesting thing, that like there was no right answer to this, and that's what makes it messy and complicated. But they do seem to have a moralistic take on him doing this action, and I just don't feel similarly. And so it sets you, like, at least for me, apart from the show, where I'm watching a show that is like engaging with like, like this argument, and I'm like, I don't even know if I agree with the terms of the argument that you're
Right.
having.
Yeah.
And so like I actually thought this episode was a huge step up from the
Mm.
previous episode.
Okay.
I found like, if this was the end of a actual like natural arcs for a lot of these characters that I felt was earned, I felt like this would have been a really fitting finale. Were they earned? Not necessarily.
Yeah. I had the exact same thought, which was like, oh, these characters like actually end up in a really interesting place relative to where they started.
Right.
Right. And it's like, oh, like if that was the journey of the show, that would have been pretty cool. But the path that it took to get there, not great, unfortunately. Anyway,
And
sorry,
I
Dan,
think
go ahead.
a lot of that is due to the mystery box format. Like if we had been like following these characters and knew what, elements of their past were being withheld from us, and we could factor that in the whole time and really play with the messiness of that and how these characters feel about it, I think we could have gotten into some of those things. But this decision to withhold and keep withholding, they even do it again in this episode, and I like laughed out loud when it happened. I think it's just like really detrimental to the story that they're trying to tell here. It feels like halfway in either direction. Either don't do it or go full into it and do the kind of Rashomon style storytelling where we're getting different perspectives. And I don't know. I would love to see where this show started in the writer's room, because I imagine it was probably a very different pitch that got sanded down in every direction to become the thing that it is today.
I agree completely. Patrick Klepek theorized on last episode that, like, my supposition was I can't imagine this story was told in the way it was originally envisioned, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just the way having literally 2 separate flashback episodes out of 8 episodes that cover a lot of the same material, like just showing us the same thing over again. I just can't imagine it was envisioned that way. And Patrick Klepek speculated maybe this was originally envisioned as like a 1-season show, but they liked it so much they're like, we got to make some changes to make it 2 seasons or more seasons. And I think certainly this episode, the way this episode ends, which we'll get to momentarily, does leave the door open for future seasons of the Acolyte, right? Like, so that to me is very possibly how this all happened. Is like they had a self-contained story and they made a bunch of changes to make it not self-contained, which would explain why Soul keeps delaying his reveals until like later and later.
I also feel like this could have been a movie. Like I think there's just not enough here to really pad it out to the length that they've padded it out without that recurring device of delay.
Yeah. And per what Dan is saying, right? If there was no mystery, if they just explained what the deal was from the beginning of what happened on Brendok, who killed who and so on, if they just did that from the start or early on and didn't delay it until episode 7, you would have more time to spend with these characters actually going through things and making changes in the present, right? Instead of they don't even know, the characters don't even know what's happening for a lot of the runtime of the show. I'll share a few brief thoughts and then let's dive into what actually happened this episode. So in terms of the Acolyte season finale, what I feel confident saying is this show continues to deliver some of the best Star Wars action of any Star Wars property in probably the last 5-10 years, right? Like the action is really well done. There's creative aspects to each one of these action fight scenes. There's often a moment in the fight scene where I'm like, oh my gosh, how did they do that? Like it's really, really impressive what they're able to accomplish. And there's multiple fight scenes in this episode that are pretty good. So really, really appreciate that. And also, per what we've already discussed, I think like if you look at where these characters end up and where they began, that's actually kind of interesting. Like you can imagine an interesting show that chronicles that journey from point A to point B. This is not that show. It did not do a good job of documenting that journey. But I like the kind of basic core idea of what they're trying to deliver. I also think just Manny Jacinto as Chimere like really uh, brought a lot of physicality and presence to that role in a way that really impressed me. So I just want to give a shout out to him. So
the design of that character is great.
Yeah. So those are some of the positive things I have to say about the finale. Everything else I thought is like from storyline perspective, character perspective, thematic perspective, I thought was kind of a disaster. It's a mess. The show does not stick the landing at all, and ultimately, I'm very disappointed. So, those are my thoughts on the episode. So let's get into kind of what actually happened, and I want to start by reading this comment from decodingtv.com. User Pernicious Ducks, one of my favorite commenters at decodingtv.com, actually thought that I was being too charitable in last week's episode of the podcast. I actually got this complaint from several people. There's some people who think the show is very bad, which I think it in many ways is, and they think I'm being too nice to the show, which I'm just like shocked. I've rarely been accused of being too nice to shows, but Pernicious Ducks writes at decodingtv.com, I don't really agree with you about how the Coven died. I feel like you're trying to make it more interesting than it is. Soul did this dumb thing and overreacted, but from his point of view, she was a mist cloud. How was that supposed to kill her? Then the Coven take over the Wookiee, and as far as I can tell, when they're forced out of his mind, it kills them. I don't know why Master Andara would know that would happen, or why she wouldn't take that course of action. They're trying to kill her coworkers. The whole thing seems like an accident, so the Jedi can still be the good guys and make a mistake. I don't think she intended to kill them. End quote. I'm just going to pause for a second. Basically, like, the question is, like, when Master Andara killed the entire Coven, like, did she intend to do that? Was it... Are we meant to interpret that as monstrous? And I think Pernicious Ducks is saying, no, we're meant to interpret that as that was an accident. Like, she was just trying to save her Wookiee friend, and she ended up killing the Coven, like, coincidentally, which I think that's probably the most correct reading. And then Pernicious Duck continues, I was talking with my wife before this, and we were guessing what the truth would be, the ultimate truth of the show. My thesis was pick whatever the most mundane, obvious answer is. That's the most logical outcome. It's the show's MO. I did guess that Soul changed Osha's memory so she would be less traumatized and invented the very stupid fire. But I guess even I was not prepared for the most lame answer that May randomly became a pyromaniac for no reason whatsoever, and that on Brendok, rocks are flammable. I unfortunately thought motives were a thing, not mundane enough. Let's look at the mysteries of the series. Who is the Sith? What's the most mundane answer? Kyber. What happened on Brendok? What's the most mundane answer? They tried what they thought was the right thing, a misunderstanding happens, and they accidentally kill the witches, or it happened in self-defense. Who is Kyber's answer? Most tedious answer? Vernestra, the somehow obviously evil Jedi. I was hopeful a few episodes into the series, but now I put this show, The Acolyte, into the same category as The Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Mandalorian Season 3. Just an awful show with a good action choreographer, ? I guess there is that. What a disappointment, end quote. And I have to say, I think I agree with 100% of that comment. I think it's whatever the most obvious answer is, that's the answer. Like,
let's go home, David. I think that comment did all the work for us.
There is like whenever there's an opportunity for there to be something cool or different or subversive, it's the most obvious answer, and that's very unfortunate. Okay, let's talk about what happens. This episode begins. We're back on the unknown planet. Osha has the helmet on. And we see that like Kyber tries to remove the helmet, but then he almost becomes like under the influence of the witches, right? Like that we saw Torben under the influence of, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I think the implication here is that Osha's force powers are like overpowering Kyber, right? Was that your interpretation of what happened in the opening scene, Dan?
That's as good a guess as any, I think. I if there's anything I really like struggled with in this episode, it's like so many new things being introduced at the end. And it's like I don't know if that even comes back in a meaningful way, other than to suggest like perhaps she's going bad, so to speak. Because I'm going to use
I will
that
say
kind
Osha,
of terminology here. Yeah,
Osha does have like a really cool outfit in this episode, right? Like I don't know if you like her black cape and outfit. I thought it's just like, oh, this is a sign that she has changed. Also, she looks very snazzy in that thing.
Yeah, I mean, subtle this show is not. So,
all right. So anyway, Osha says that she had a vision of May with her hand outstretched. Who she was killing Saul. She had a saber in her hand, but she wouldn't use it. And then Kyber says, "Oh, this is the future you saw. She can kill with no weapon." And the two of them decide they're going to go after May. I don't know that the whole like killing with no weapon really added up to anything, Dan. At the end of this, like I don't.
Again, to me, it reads as like working backwards from some kind of like twisty thing they wanted to do in this episode, right?
Right. Well, yeah. What ends up happening that we know, right? Spoilers, right? Is that it's Osha that kills Soul with no weapon, right?
Right.
And so, and Osha and May are the same person. We all figured that out last week, basically. So she's seeing herself kill Soul and doing it with no weapon, and so like that's how that all ties together. Is that a particularly satisfying moment? I don't know. Like if you found it satisfying, great, but like Dan, it sounds like it didn't do it for you or me, right? Like that part locking into place didn't really do it for you or me.
I mean, it's not really like a premonition when you set it up to be to be so from the beginning. Like you hang a piñata and then you give another guy a bat. It's like, okay, those things are going to like collide in some way. Like it's like a puzzle piece like that had no reason to exist. Oh, I guess it fits here. I don't know. I mean, that's about as much satisfaction as you can get.
The show, I guess a different way of putting it is the show didn't necessarily do enough to make this killing with no weapon something that was like very emotionally significant. I think that's what I would argue.
Yeah. I mean, it's just as thin as that. Like you have to do it with no weapon so that when we reveal something has no weapon, you can go, aha. Like that's about the satisfaction level.
Soul, we're back on Soul's ship, and Soul and May have an argument like, we assume that Soul described everything that happened from last week's episode to me. I think that's what happens.
Absolutely.
Off screen, right? And Dan, I have to confess to you, at this moment that we're back on the ship, I am still hoping that there's going to be some other reveal of what happened on Brendok. I'm still hoping that it's going to be like, you started the fire, and it's like, there was no fire, or something else. It was Soul that started the fire. Like, I'm hoping there is something else that, and it's like, nope, they're laying it out. He says,
gets dangerously close. Like, it's like, it keeps like, setting it up.
You started the fire, and she says, because the Jedi invaded our home. It's like, oh, it's just literally stuff we already saw last episode. There's a lot of like repeating exposition on the show. May uses Pip to escape from her restraints. I have to say, this is actually the most upsetting part of the episode to me. Like, way more upsetting than Soul dying, way more upsetting than May and Osha, whatever the hell happened between them. May using Pip to be on her side and be against Osha is like, dude, not cool. Not cool to like use someone's robot against them.
Something explored in Solo to a greater effect. The sort of like liberty of robots. Going back to the whole like revealing of things to May. Like metatextually, I guess I appreciated that scene, if only for me to clarify, like, no, the thing that they think we're supposed to be surprised by is that he killed her mother. Like, because, after the end of the previous episode, I'm like, okay, well, which information of that was the significant thing? So, like, at the very least, I appreciated them going like, hey, viewer, like, it was supposed to be the mom's death. That's the thing we're upset about. Yeah.
Right. Which again, May already knew about, or saw. Like, I don't think her mind was her mind wiped. I don't think so. Anyway. Okay.
She was turning into dust too somehow. Anyway.
All right. So May escapes, and there's this great moment when May says, "See you in hell, Jedi," and then closes the door. I like that. I looked it up. Is there a hell in Star Wars?
And according to Han Solo references it in Empire Strikes Back.
According to Wikipedia, there's this place called Chaos, which is also referred to as hell in Corellian mythology, also known as the Void, a dark region of the netherworld of the Force inhabited by the spirits of deceased Dark Lords of the Sith, Dark Jedi, and the spirits of all evil sentient beings who had died, end quote. Which I have to say sounds like a pretty cool place to hang out, Dan Gvozden. Hell would be a pretty cool place in the Star Wars universe.
Han Solo is Corellian, so I guess it makes sense that he would make that reference in Empire.
Yes. And May has also been around the galaxy, so, she would also know about it, maybe. Okay. So May takes an escape ship, and then Soul is in hot pursuit. There's a pretty cool chase scene through an asteroid belt. Like, I don't know, I thought this is pretty awesome. Because there's little like baby asteroids. They're pelting the ship. You can really feel the texture of these little asteroids. I thought the sound design was great. And then basically May's ship ends up crashing onto the planet below, and Soul follows her. And it's Brendok. It's Brendok, the place where it all went down.
Yeah, I like this sequence a lot. I mean, again, it's another one where I feel like the visual effects team takes over, and suddenly it gets way more deft in terms of its filmmaking. And it was fun. I mean, we've seen a lot of asteroids before in Empire and in Attack of the Clones, but I don't think we've seen ships going through the rings of a planet in an interesting way. I thought that was neat. I don't really understand why Basil decided to suddenly start messing with Saul's ship and crash it onto the planet below. Did you understand what was going on there?
As of right now, I don't get that. It's heavily indicated that Basil, like during the chase, I think maybe Basil doesn't want Soul to kill May. That was the only thing I could come up with. Was like,
is he like a double agent for the Jedi proper?
Right? Yeah. Well, because they're in a very dangerous situation. But then what Basil does seems to put them in more physical jeopardy based on like, because the ship starts like barrel rolling through these asteroids. It's like, huh.
It's cool. I just was like in the moment,
Yeah,
like, did I miss something here?
well,
And that's very
Basil
likely.
definitely is on the side of the Jedi, right? Like
Yes.
he's helping to track for them later on in the episode. So maybe he's working on behalf of the Jedi. Whatever it is, we missed that. Sorry. Feel free to leave it as a comment on YouTube or whatever the actual answer is. But as of right now, we're not clear on what the hell Basil was doing in that situation.
Who knows how aliens think?
There is a cool scene in Coruscant with Senator Raincourt, who's there to visit Master Venestra, and he essentially says, "Hey, it's really upsetting what I've heard that you guys are investigating some murder, but you haven't told the Senate about it." And Vernestra's like, "I am authorized to take care of these events independently." And Raincourt says, "Hey, I think the Jedi are a massive system of unchecked power posing as a religion, a delusional cult that claims to control the uncontrollable, not the Force, your emotions. You project an image of goodness and restraint, but it's only a matter of time before one of you snaps," end quote. The truest truths that someone has ever said on this show. And are we supposed to think he's wrong or right? Because he is speaking truth right now, right? Like everything he's saying is correct.
I like this line in the writing of it, but it is something that like I find kind of dismaying about like how they're utilizing this sort of High Republic era, which is to say, like, to have someone lay out the themes of the fall of the Jedi, when in an era where they're supposed to be at their peak, to me is just kind of rehashing. And I think we talked about this when I was on last time. It's just like it to me, it's like we already got that story. I want a different take on this, and and the Jedi being kind of secretive and overpowered, and I kind of want to see the heroic era of the Jedi as described. And I feel like we're just dipping into prequel territory with characters like this. As good as the line and as truthful as the line is, like, to me, it's kind of like this whole like Jedi, are they good or bad? I think is a really interesting conversation to have, like, in with the context of the prequels and what would eventually follow in the reign of the Empire. But it would be nice to see like the full-throated like contrast to that represented somewhere. And I thought this show would be more it, although of course it's very conflicted at the heart of it. And maybe that's the point, is there is no true heroic era for the Jedi. But I do think it's a missed opportunity to show us something still very different with the Jedi than grounds we've trod on many times before.
The question is, what do we leave the show feeling about the Jedi, right? Like,
yeah,
and what does the show want us to leave the show thinking about the Jedi? And I would actually guess that there is no real answer to that, because I think the show is setting up for a season 2.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that you and I were looking for something that was like, actually the Jedi sucked, or actually the Jedi were good but problematic, right? And
yeah,
I don't really think the show takes it takes even either one of those positions, in my opinion. Like, yes, the Jedi suck in many ways, but like, um, I think at the end of the day, we're still kind of meant to root for them. Like, I am quite confused. We'll get to the ending. We'll talk about the ending momentarily. But like,
even on this point that Raincourt suggests here about like Jedi needing to like withhold their emotions, I'm like, I've seen no evidence of that on this show. Like Saul, who is our main Jedi here, is emotional about how much he loves this girl he spots from a distance the minute he spots her, and no one like really rebuffs him about it, not really, and it doesn't seem like that much of an aberration.
I don't know if I'd go that far, Dan. I actually disagree with you there. I think like it is framed as an aberrant thing, because Dan, it turns out the real acolyte was love. But no, I'm serious. Like, I think that it is made out to be like, oh, he is violating the rules by loving this person, right? And maybe we're meant to think, hey, that's what is an institution that would outlaw that kind of thing, But again, we already kind of got that take in like the prequels, for instance, right? Like, how challenging it is to not have emotion when you're in the Jedi Order. Anyway.
I guess I'm just wondering what the counter to that is. Like, like within this story, was he supposed to just let these women like mess with these girls and their future, like and leave them alone? Like I guess what I mean is, like, I don't know that I ever bought his like
Yeah.
love. You know, like it seemed much more of a mission to investigate this vergence in the Force for him than it did like legitimately loving this child.
I think that's
And
a huge problem with the show, and that kind of came out in last episode, right? Which is like, why is Saul so attached to these people, right? Like,
yeah,
why is and the show gives us nothing. Like, the show gives us nothing to like. Saul had a child, you know, these children remind him of them, you know, like,
yeah,
there's just nothing. He just happens to have an attachment to these people and is willing to literally put every single one of them in danger because he loves these people and wants them to be protected by this coven, and theoretically wants them to be able to go become Jedi if they want to. Like, that's it. That's it. And that's a big shortcoming of the show, I think, is that it doesn't do a good enough job of establishing why Soul would care. Like, having Soul spend more time with these people would have been something that you could have done to like, if he learns about their personalities and develops an attachment. Instead, he spends like 10 minutes with them, right? Like,
yeah.
it's it's a confusing way to do this, I think.
I guess to clarify my point earlier, it's like, yeah, it's an aberration that he loves them, but like that love seems so easily accessed by
Mm-hmm.
Saul. Like it
Yeah.
seems like it's a active part of his character.
Right.
Like is a guy that just falls in love with things when he sees them, you know? Like
Yeah.
like he's you know, he seems caring. And yeah, we've met other Jedi that are caring, but it didn't do anything to like really give us a challenge to why the statement by this guy Rayancourt is so problematic. And I'll end my commentary on this here.
Right. Well, I think we don't see him, in my opinion, we don't see him particularly being like very tortured about this, right? Like,
Yeah.
he's not like, oh, I love these girls, but also my Jedi training says this, but also, you know, we don't see any of that real navigation. He's just like, we gotta save these girls. It's like right from the start. It's like, we gotta save these girls, and that's it. And we don't see him navigate those priorities. And I think
Yeah, and like
that's a problem. Yeah.
criticize the prequels all you want, but Anakin is tortured throughout those movies in ways that are, you know, really melodramatic, but like he's clearly wrestling with like,
Yeah.
how do I lock out my emotions over my mother, the visions I'm
Right.
having about my dying wife, etc., that
Yeah.
ultimately causes his turn. Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, Osha and Kymir are going together to try to get May. Like, uh, I think the whole May Kymir thing is really just a mess this whole season. Like, May is working for Kymir, then she's not, then kind of they're okay with each other by this episode. It's just, it's not convincing at all, in my opinion. But anyway, Kymir offers like, "Hey, would you ever want to train with me?" And Osha says, "No, I'm not my sister." And Kymir says, "Wow, May made that deal without even thinking about it," which is like, "Oh, they're so different." But see, ironically, it's Osha that ends up training with Kymir, Dan. So that's why it's so ironic. Um,
That
in the
seems to be behind all of this. It's just like writers
yeah,
going, wouldn't that be
yeah,
ironic? But
wouldn't that
like
be ironic? Yeah,
it's fascinating. Like Kymir's like, you know, for all the work he put in to get this far, he doesn't really do a lot to like try to convince her. And she says no, and then he's like, okay, let's leave the planet together. And you're like, what? Like I thought she was captive by him. And anyway,
yeah, yeah. Who knows what's going on there? Okay. Anyway, in the shadows, we see a mysterious force in the shadows of the cave.
okay, I
Uh,
want to ask you what you thought when you saw this, because my immediate thought was, we're never going to see this character again in this episode.
my opinion was that was probably the Darth Plagueis reference that we've been hearing about prior to the show. The character who's referenced by Emperor Palpatine in the prequels, who like is, you know, has knowledge of creating life from nothing. So I actually think this is a major character, Dan. I don't know if we'll see them again, but I think it's like People seem to think it's Darth Plagueis. I thought it was Darth Plagueis. Yeah, it means
I
nothing
missed
to
that
you.
news cycle about Darth Plagueis being in this. So I mean, like, that's a good guess, I think. I missed that news cycle that said that was going to happen.
So, okay, it's Darth Plagueis. If you don't know who Darth Plagueis is, it means nothing. It's, whatever. It's a fun Easter egg. Maybe it'll be relevant in season 2 if there is a season 2. All paths converge on Brendok. Sol goes into the woods to search for May. Vernestra arrives from Coruscant in pursuit of Sol. Everyone goes to the fortress where it happened. And then Kyber shows up and has a fight with Sol. The Sol Kyber fight, I have to say, is pretty solid. There's a moment when Kyber takes out a mini lightsaber. He deconstructs his lightsaber into 2 pieces and has a mini lightsaber and a full lightsaber. And I thought that was pretty badass, Dan. What did you think?
I accept it. I know my last time I was on here, I was very anti lightsaber whip. I am pro lightsaber that splits into a dagger lightsaber.
Yes.
That fits very squarely in my lightsaber rule book that I apparently am writing.
It's also just Kyber likes to fight dirty, and that's a very I have one blade that deconstructs and can stab you in the
yeah.
There's some really cool moments when the 2 lightsabers are converging on Sol's position, and he does this force blast that moves them all away. Some really nice moments in this fight. Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
I also really like the setting of it a lot in this destroyed, witch's temple, where it's growing over it again. It feels like Star Wars to me, which is lived in sci-fi.
Yeah.
When so much of the show has felt I think I compared it last time to a Disney theme park ride where it's just a little bit too high gloss.
Yeah.
This felt like the lived in decayed world of Star Wars that I'm used to seeing.
Yeah.
And so I really like that. And, even as a thematic or visual parallel to the sort of tainted nature of the galaxy as the Jedi themselves are being corrupted in some form. And revisiting all the old sites of the bridge that broke down. I mean, I know it was just last episode that we saw this stuff, but seeing it in such harsh contrast while they're fighting through it, I thought was a really nice touch.
Yeah, I agree. Osha and May fight each other as well. They confront each other and they fight. And I have to say, I think the Osha May stuff in general looks really good. Most of the time, I am never questioning the idea that we're seeing 2 separate humans, when in fact they're both played by one person. And that was true of the fight. And yes, you can really only see one of their faces clearly at a time, but I thought it was well done. So anyway,
I love there's a moment where they're grappling with each other and it does this harsh cut to the lightsaber fight where their blades are crossed, and it's this brilliant parallel cut. And it's oh my gosh, when this show comes alive, it really does do cool things. And moments like that remind you, oh, I'm watching a Star Wars. This can be great fun and clever filmmaking.
Sol gets the upper hand on Kyber and disables his lightsaber, and May intervenes and steals the lightsaber, and there's a big confrontation between all of them, and Sol gives this long monologue where he reveals a major twist that everyone already knew. He says, quote, "I did the right thing. I wanted to protect you both. You are not twins. You and Osha are the same person. I don't know how your mother did it, but it has something to do with the virgins on this planet. She created life, your lives. I believe she used the Force to create you and Osha. Do you have any idea what kind of power that is? In the history of the galaxy, very few have been that powerful," end quote. And then, of course, the response is, "And you killed her." You killed her, this most powerful person. And he says, "Yes, I did. I was protecting you. It was the right thing to do. Without May, there was no proof that you were created this way. They would have sent you away. You, Osha, were too old to train. They never would have let you become a Jedi. I did what I thought was best for you. Of course, I wanted to tell you so many times, but I couldn't. I kept this from you so you could have the life you'd always dreamed of. I did everything because I love..." And then he's cut off because he's force choked to death by Osha. It's meant to be a very tragic moment, when Sol dies. We see Vernestra mourning over him later on as well. I gotta say, I didn't really feel that much for Sol. Dan Gvozden. Soul kind of sucks, in my opinion. Like, he's not very good at his job. He keeps making mistakes. He always is about on the verge of telling you important information and then
Yes.
is electrocuted.
Fitting that's how he dies, is not finishing a sentence.
I would say the majority of what we're shown of Soul is that he kind of sucks, and
And
when
is a
he
decent
dies,
fighter.
he's a great fighter, but other than that, he kind of sucks. And so when Vernestra at the end says, he was a great man, he made a terrible decision. It's like most of what we saw was him making terrible decisions. Like, we didn't see the great part. That's the thing. Is like we didn't see the decades that happened after this where he was a great man. Like, and I think that's a problem for the show and for me emotionally, at least. Dan Gvozden, what do you think?
I also think it's where the show kind of like plays its hand. Like, it clearly wants you to root for the guy that's coded as a Jedi, because it's like, you'll just assume he's great because he's a Jedi, like, and
yeah,
so like,
that's what I was gonna say. Is like the ending of this episode where Vernestra says, he's a great man, he made terrible decisions, and then there's that shot of him on the burning pyre, like over the water, which is very beautiful. Like, I think that sums up what the show's vision of Saul is. I don't think we're meant to like interpret that as like a false, like, or that we're supposed to say like, oh, there's some subtext that is actually bad here. I don't think so. I think that's how the show sees him, and I don't think the show does a good job of conveying that to us, right? So anyway, sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I have multiple feelings about this, good and bad. I love the moment where he's cut off while saying "I love you." I think it's a great, cool end for like a character. Again, if they'd engaged with all the idea of like what it meant for this guy to love someone and then be undone by that love, is really interesting. And like a better show would have stuck that landing, which is why you probably felt nothing about it, on top of Saul being incompetent generally. But like like the construct of it is, there's a lot to admire there. What I don't like about his final speech is that it all comes down to this like vergence thing, which might as well be like magic mumbo jumbo gobbledygook. It is a like sci-fi concept that means almost nothing to us, the audience. Yes, it's something from Revenge of the Sith and Phantom Menace, and there is more mythos to be explored in season 2 with Darth Plagueis, as you're suggesting. Like, and maybe we'll find out what the reason for that vergence is. But like, emotionally in the moment, I don't think he would have I don't think he would have gone that route. He would have said like, I acted in the moment. I was reacting to her turning into particles before my eyes, like, or like, and then that's messier than just blaming it on some magic thing to be solved in later seasons. To say like, I cared about you and I was scared and acted out, and like, and then we can really like judge how we feel about
it. Would have been even more interesting if it wasn't a spur of the moment decision, right? It would have been even more interesting if it was like he had made a calculated move to like somehow prevent Mother Anastasia from hanging on to Osha, and then that accidentally caused her death or something. But the show doesn't really grapple with that explicitly, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think it wants you to see Saul in like an entirely bad light. Yeah. And so it kind of like blames it on a magic thing that's the MacGuffin that's driving him forward instead of character choice. And I think that would have been a lot stronger and would have underlined the power of, it's because I loved you, rather than it's because I happen to love you while chasing after magical thing on said planet. It's like, and it's just another hat on a hat. It's just more complicated thing. And so I think there was a way to streamline that. But I think it's also part and parcel with the rest of the show is it wasn't really willing to go there.
Yeah. So Osha chokes Soul to death. Kyber reaches out to comfort Osha, and then Osha grabs Soul's lightsaber and turns it on, and it turns red slowly. And I have to say, yes, obviously the show has a lot of problems, but kind of cool, Dan. What do you think?
The nerd in me is like screaming during this
Like, excuse
because
me, pushing my glasses up.
yes, exactly.
Excuse me, the
And
Kyber
yeah,
crystal is not red. It has to be programmed that way.
yes,
But
yeah, that is
it's
exactly like and so like the rule for Star Wars that has always, like, my opinion, and I was a big lore kid growing up. I read all of the expanded universe stuff, like, but something being cool always trumps being logical within the lore of Star Wars, because like you could endlessly pick holes in it. I think this one is like really on the line for me because it's
Mhm.
definitely cool,
Yeah,
but the sort of like my emotions are turning evil turns my blade red is kind of silly, because we've seen Anakin Skywalker with a blue blade and
right.
he's certainly far more evil than this person. But then the thing that really kind of didn't work for me in this scene is that, like, we got done seeing May go like, I want to see Saul put before the high council, before this tribunal, and have him really be like tried for his sins.
Yeah,
And then a second later her sister just murders him, and there's no confrontation there.
right.
They just are like, let's run off together.
Okay, yeah,
And
cool.
yeah,
All right, that's my second choice. Is
and it's something
yeah,
that's happened throughout this show, which is like characters change their opinions on the drop of a
yeah.
pin or whatever, or whatever the phrase is. I
Drop
think
of a
about,
hat.
like, I think,
Drop of a
yeah,
hat.
drop of a hat. There, there's like it was at episode 3 where May suddenly just like they're running through the forest and she's like, wait a minute, like, I agree with Soul and I'm going to go help him.
Right. Brutal.
Yeah,
Brutal.
brutal, and it was like, where did this come from? And I feel similarly here, which is you have two characters make big dramatic speeches about who they are, only to then not pursue the conflict in that.
I was actually kind of got emotional a little bit when she's like, "I want Soul to like confess to the Jedi Council and suffer for his
Yes.
crimes." I was like, "Oh, like yeah, I'm actually feeling something for once watching the show. Like, I want
Yeah.
May to get what she wants, and then for them to just completely drop that. Okay, whatever." Um, so then May and Osha run away together. We learn how May survived. She got sucked into a tube. Dan, she got
Like
sucked
Luke
into a tube
Skywalker,
as
classic,
as it
classic
happens. A
Star Wars. Yeah.
classic tube suck
Yeah.
is what happens to
Who's building these things here?
You're talking about like on Bespin, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
am. Cloud City, which
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah. So
over
yeah,
Bespin, but yes.
yeah. Anyway, so she got sucked into a tube, and they kind of run out, and there is a nice moment where they kind of meet at the tree, and she says like, "I came to this tree to wait for you, and you never came," and so on. And then they have a moment where they cry about the life they have lost together, and then
It's like
some
before sunset.
right, yeah, and then something really confusing happens, Dan Gvozden, where they like Osha is like, okay, now I'm gonna like Osha says to Chimera, "Let my sister go, and I will train with you." First of all, unclear what Chimera's position is on May at this point. Like, does he want to capture her? Does he want to kill her? Whatever. Who gives a shit? Certainly, the show doesn't, in my opinion.
I felt that
Um,
way about everyone's motives in
yeah,
this episode.
yeah.
I'm like,
So
what do they want
What do they want?
here?
Whatever. Who gives a shit? And then May says, "Are you sure the Jedi will use me to try to find you?" May is being smart. She's like, "Hey, if you just switch places with me, the Jedi are gonna, help use my brain or whatever to find you." So Chimera's like, "I can attempt to wipe her memory." Let's stop here for a moment. To me, this plan makes absolutely no sense. First of all, May is still in trouble for having murdered multiple Jedi, and
Yes.
you're gonna like wipe her memory of like all the shit. Like you're leaving May in a really terrible spot.
Yeah.
Say, and
Don't
then
worry, David. They just want to hand wave this away, literally.
and then secondly, as we find out later in the episode, it's not like the Jedi are gonna forget that May and Osha like Vernestra already knows that they're sisters. So like you're just delaying May finding out all the answers again, and then it's a terrible plan. It fails almost immediately. I mean, okay, it doesn't fail in the sense that when Kyber and Osha are at the mystery planet at the end of the episode, which by the way has been confirmed to not be Luke's Octo planet from Last Jedi.
Oh,
by Leslie Headland. The plan works in the sense that the Jedi don't immediately know where to go. You know what I'm saying? So like,
yes,
great. So that it did work in that regard, but it's also leaving May in a terrible, vulnerable situation, right? Where she's murdered these people, she doesn't even understand why she murdered them. And unfortunately, Vernestra takes pity on her and decides to cover up all the murders.
Well, I mean, is there an implication that like Vernestra has some other motive going on? Like it is hinted at here and outright confirmed that Kyber was Venestra's, Padawan or something at some point, and that's the big dangling plot line. I think that like they want you to be hooked for season 2. And I can tell you, I really don't care. Like it is not something that I am altogether curious about.
I think the only way I can see this show being redeemed in my eyes is like to really double down on the evil Vernestra plotline. We already pointed out maybe her lightsaber whip was used to whip Kyber. You know, so like Kyber is an old pupil and maybe it's Vernestra that's going to be like the evil force that one of the evil forces that helps lead to the downfall of the Empire of the Jedi. Or helps to like accelerate the downfall of the Jedi. Maybe I don't know, but like that's the only way that this really ends up being good, in my opinion. Because otherwise, if not what I just said, right, then what happens at the end of this episode is, hey, Soul made these horrible mistakes by covering up the death of all these people, right? And then Vernestra is like, in order to redeem that, I'm going to do the exact same thing as Soul did, which is I'm going to cover up all the deaths of these people and blame it on Soul. And there is the potential that we're meant to view that in a positive light because Vernestra is taking pity on May. She's like, you've been through enough. The Jedi have treated you like shit, and we're not going to put you on trial for this. We're going to blame it on Soul instead. But she is then doing the exact same mistake that Soul made and like setting a time bomb or a landmine that's going to explode sometime in the future. So in order for this show to like be at all thematically resonant or satisfying, it's got to be Vernestra's evil, in my opinion. What do you think, Dan Gvozden?
I mean, do you have any doubt that she's evil? Like to me, this is all coded.
You think it's very clear.
As
you think the show is meant to be like she's evil.
I think it's coded clearly that she's like a bad Jedi. Like she's having this conversation with this guy that's like, don't like, I'm gonna wag my finger at you and say your emotions are getting in the way. Like, we saw the whip that came out and we never see ever again. Like, why would they include that in the show if that wasn't going to be some big thing that comes up in the future? I think everybody thought it would be this episode and it ended up not being. Like, I think everything is there for this person to be the evil Jedi of some kind, whatever that is. Again, I think this is a repeat of what we already saw in the prequels. I don't need to see the fall of the Jedi when I've already seen the fall of the Jedi, but maybe there is some extra interesting wrinkle there. And it makes me think back to the marketing of this show, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that we were like being told that by the end of this season, we would understand the birth of the Sith in some way. And I don't feel like the word Sith has been used yet.
It has.
So maybe has it?
Yep. He said some like when Kyber was first revealed, he said like some call me Sith, or you might call me Sith, or something like that.
Fair enough.
All right, maybe that's true. So you're saying, okay, evil Vernestra is very clear, and like we're meant to root against her, I guess, at the end of the show.
I think so. That's my read, and I'd be curious what other people say. But like,
if so, then I think that's fine. Like again, it's not saying that the show hasn't made any mistakes leading up to this point, but
I
don't know. I mean, like The question is, right?
Did you not feel when the Jedi were coming to the planet at the end that you were like, I don't want them to get caught up here because there's something else going on with Venestra and her Jedi group? Because I felt that the whole time. Like, oh no, we don't want the Jedi to discover what is going on this planet. They're not actually a force
Right.
for
I think we're
saving them. Yeah.
one of the great things about the show is that it does show the Jedi as oppressors, right? And I think that is like a somewhat unique perspective. But I think the reason why I have some doubts about your reading, Dan Gvozden, is that at the end, first of all, Vernestra makes a slip where she says, Sol made a mistake. He justified every selfish step with the love he had for your sister. And then May says, my sister? And then Vernestra's like, I've made a huge, tiny mistake. I didn't mean to say your sister. No, but like, I mean, Vernestra would have no reason to think that May's entire memory had been wiped of her sister and everything. So like, but Vernestra says like, hey, I need your help finding a pupil of mine, right? Cut to, we see Kyber and Osha on this beach, holding hands. And I think we're like, oh, this is setting up for these two forces to collide. Are we meant to think both of them are evil, Dan? Like, because that's not particularly satisfying, And then cut to Vernestra walking through the door and saying to Yoda, the Yoda, we need to talk. And Yoda, in general, I think we think of as a good guy, right? So she's like recruiting Yoda to like help her out to take down this evil Jedi that now has Osha with him. Like that's what I thought is like, oh, the show is setting up like Vernestra chasing Kyber, like the forces of good versus the force of evil, and that's why I think the show is more thematically jumbled, than you might think it is. But hey, and that's just kind of
I think that's a very fair read.
Yeah.
I would say like me saying that Venestra is evil is not me saying that the show is thematically clear, because I actually think we're kind of meant to both root for
Yes.
Osha and Kyber as well. Like I mean, I didn't leave this episode going, those are the evil force, in the world. They're somewhat sympathetic in their own way. Like I think the show was very muddled about how we're supposed to feel. I mean, even last or 2 episodes ago when we were talking, Kyber was very kind to Osha, and that's reflected the opposite, by how Sol treated May. And so like they've set all that up to be confusing in some way. I don't think it's quite the hard cut between Venestra and them on the beach as you're suggesting. It maybe wants that, but it didn't land that, if that's what it wanted to do.
I think this show feels like a show that wanted to really be a sort of screed against the Jedi. Like, really, like, let's take the Jedi down a notch. Like, they kind of sucked. And then, like, other creative forces got in the way and were like, well, they can't be that bad because a lot of kids dress up as Jedi. Like, we have a ride where you play Jedi, like, we have a ride at Disneyland where you play the Jedi, like,
yeah.
And it kind of like tempered that. And then what we end up getting is this kind of muddled mess of a thing that doesn't really end up saying much of anything, in my opinion.
They also have a fascism store at Disneyland where you can go and buy just Empire stuff. But yeah, well, that's a whole other point.
So anyway, I think that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like, hey, the definition of a show that's kind of pulling its punches.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. What do you think of the reveal of Yoda? I mean, I've been joking with my friends who have watched the show with me that, it's one of those things. Oh, Yoda, he's just around the corner in every scene. We just don't have the budget for it. But there it was. There was Yoda.
It's fine, whatever. Yeah. Cool, I guess. Like, I've never gone for that kind of stuff. Like, what is interesting to me is when you take something that we already knew and then like recontextualize it into, like a good example of this would be like Furiosa, right? Like,
yeah,
the Mad Max saga, where like we learn how Furiosa lost her arm in that movie, and it's like, oh wow, like that is so much more significant now. Now that we know how she lost her arm, right? Like, as opposed to just, hey, remember the thing that you saw from the last movie? Like that doesn't impress.
It's doing exactly what you remember, which is Master Yoda is teaching people ostensibly, on Coruscant.
It's not impressive to me to be like, oh, hey, it's a thing that like that doesn't impress me.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Dan Gvozden, any other thoughts on the Acolyte season finale before we wrap up today?
I don't think that this is the disaster of, the Book of Boba Fett. I think like this is also a confused show, but one that I think set its sights a little bit higher and just didn't have the execution to pull it off. But I appreciate the swing, like point to the outfield and stake your claim and miss the swing, but you swing nevertheless. And so I appreciate that.
Again, I think this show is technically really impressive and has some spectacular action scenes, and therefore is worth watching for that reason alone. From a storytelling perspective, is a complete mess, and yeah, I think it's a huge wasted opportunity because there's some things the show does really well. In addition to the action, like its depiction of the Jedi, I thought was like kind of refreshing. But it just doesn't really add up to that much at the end of the day. And that is a huge bummer because, they spent like $200 million in this thing. And it's a shame that at the end of this journey, I don't feel like, oh, wow, that was very satisfying. Like I feel like, wow, there's just so many wasted opportunities left and right here. And not a great show in my opinion.
In some ways, their ambition is their greatest folly. Like, why did we need this twisty turny up and down, left and right thing? Like a good solid Star Wars adventure, like the pulp magazines and movies that Star Wars was based on. It can be plenty. I mean, I even think about like the video games that have been coming out with like really solid Star Wars tales in them that are much more straightforward. And I don't. Does every Star Wars property need to be a mystery? Like, yes, I understand that like the Darth Vader reveal was very impactful, but like, I don't know that I feel like mystery and withholding of secrets is a core part of the Star Wars storytelling franchise in quite the same way that Disney, I think, seems to think that mystery should be at the heart of a lot of these things.
Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.